Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. I never thought I'd be sitting in a doctor's office, heart pounding harder than it should, not from fear, but from something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the way life sometimes surprises you just when you've stopped expecting it to. That morning, the air outside had that cool, crisp smell that comes just before spring decides to show itself. I remember holding my coffee mug tightly, staring out the window, convincing myself that this was just another routine checkup. Nothing special. Nothing to overthink. But deep down, I knew I wasn't the same woman I used to be. I was tired of repeating days that all looked the same, tired of pretending that I didn't feel the quiet emptiness creeping into my evenings. When I walked into the clinic, it smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The waiting room was nearly empty, save for a young couple filling out forms and an older man reading a newspaper that looked like it had been folded one too many times. The receptionist gave me a polite smile, and I sat near the window, my thoughts louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Dr. Carter had been my physician for years, though we'd never really spoken beyond the usual formalities: blood pressure, prescriptions, reminders about vitamins. He was steady, calm, the kind of man who made you feel that everything could be fixed if you just followed directions. I respected that about him. But that day, something in his tone when he called my name was different. He greeted me with his usual warm nod, but his eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than usual. "How have you been, really?" he asked. Not the typical "how are you?" doctors ask out of habit, but a real question, gentle, genuine, as if he actually wanted to know. I hesitated before answering. "I've been managing," I said softly. He motioned for me to sit, and as I did, he leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Managing doesn't sound like thriving," he said with a small smile. "You used to come in with stories about your garden, your walks. Haven't heard one of those in a while." That made me pause. I hadn't realized anyone noticed that about me. I looked down at my hands and chuckled. "You have a good memory, doctor. I guess life just got quieter." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes quiet is peace. Sometimes it's a sign we've stopped listening to what makes us feel alive." I didn't know what to say. It was strange, having someone see through you like that, especially someone who's only ever seen you through a clipboard and test results. He went through my medical chart, asked the usual questions, but there was a softness in his tone I hadn't heard before. At one point, he closed the folder and said, "You know, I think we doctors forget that healing isn't always about medicine. It's about connection too. You look like you've been carrying more than you say." I smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Maybe I have," I admitted. Then, just when I thought the appointment was wrapping up, he surprised me. "Listen," he said, glancing at the clock. "I have a short break before my next patient. Would you mind joining me for a cup of coffee downstairs? Just coffee, nothing formal. I think you could use a change of setting, even if it's just the hospital cafeteria." I blinked at him, unsure what to say. Doctors didn't usually ask their patients for coffee, but something about the sincerity in his voice made me nod. "All right," I said quietly. The cafeteria was nearly empty at that hour. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, painting the tables in gold and shadow. He bought 2 coffees, handed me one, and we sat by the window overlooking the small courtyard. For the first few minutes, we talked about small things: how unpredictable the weather had been, the latest book he was reading, my garden that I hadn't touched since winter. But gradually, the conversation deepened. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone in years: how I'd been feeling lost, how routine had turned into something heavy, how even small joys felt distant lately. He listened, not the kind of listening that waits for its turn to respond, but the kind that holds space for silence. At one point, he said quietly, "You remind me of someone I knew years ago. She always took care of everyone else, but she forgot she was allowed to take care of herself too." I felt something shift in me then. Maybe it was the way he said it, or maybe it was the truth in his words. I met his eyes and said, "Maybe we all forget that sometimes." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. But it's never too late to remember." When the coffee grew cold, he stood and smiled gently. You don't have to go through this part of life feeling invisible. You have stories left to live, not just memories to look back on. I left the clinic that day feeling lighter, though I couldn't explain why. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment, just a conversation that lingered like a melody I couldn't stop humming. That night, as I sat by my window, the city lights flickering below, I realized something. Sometimes, the people we least expect remind us that we're still capable of feeling, growing, beginning again. And that day, my doctor surprised me not with medicine, but with kindness. A reminder that healing isn't always found in a prescription, but in the simple act of being seen. That I didn't know it then, but that coffee would be the start of something I'd carry with me for a long, long time. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. After that unexpected coffee at the clinic, I told myself it was a one-time thing, just a kind gesture from a kind man who probably did that for everyone who looked a little tired. But a week later, I got a call from his office. Not from a nurse, not a reminder for an appointment, his own voice. "Mrs. Jameson," he said, with that steady calm I was beginning to recognize, "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I wanted to check if you've started the walking routine we talked about. You mentioned you missed your old routes." I smiled to myself, surprised by how his voice could warm a quiet afternoon. "Well," I said, "I thought about it. That counts for something, right?" He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded like it came from someone who didn't laugh often but meant it when they did. "It does," he said. "But I'll tell you what, if you need company for that first walk, I'm around on Saturday morning. The park near Willow Lane. I usually go for a jog there." For a moment, I didn't answer. My instinct told me to decline. It felt unusual, maybe even a little too personal. But something inside me wanted to say yes, maybe because it had been so long since someone invited me to do something without an agenda. "Saturday, then," I said finally. "But no jogging. I don't want to ruin your pace." "Deal," he replied. Saturday morning came with that soft light that makes everything look a little kinder. I wore my old walking shoes, a light sweater, and the scarf my daughter had given me last Christmas. The park smelled of dew and earth. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, and a few early joggers moved along the paths. Dr. Carter was already there, leaning on a bench, holding 2 paper cups of coffee again. When he saw me, he smiled, not the polite smile of a doctor greeting a patient, but the warm, human kind that reaches the eyes. "I come prepared," he said, handing me one. "Black, no sugar, right?" I blinked, surprised he remembered. "You have an unusually good memory for small things, doctor." He shrugged lightly. "Details matter. They're what make people real." We started walking slowly along the trail, and for a while, we didn't talk. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that lets you breathe. The park was waking up around us, leaves rustling, birds cutting the air with soft cries, and the distant sound of someone's dog chasing a ball. Eventually, he asked, "Do you ever miss the noise? The kind that used to fill your house?" I glanced at him. "Every day," I said quietly. "But you get used to the quiet. It becomes like an old coat, heavy, but familiar." He nodded. "I know that kind of quiet. I had it too, once." I turned toward him, curious. "You?" He smiled faintly. "My wife passed away almost 8 years ago. For a long time, I lived like a man walking through fog. I worked, I spoke, I functioned, but I didn't really live." Something in his voice softened me. "I'm sorry," I said. He shook his head. "Don't be. Grief isn't something you fix. It becomes part of you, like a shadow that walks beside you. But every so often, someone or something reminds you that you can still feel the sun." We walked in silence again after that, but it wasn't the heavy kind. It felt honest, shared. 2 people who'd both lost something, finding a strange comfort in knowing they weren't alone in that loss. At one point, he stopped near the small lake that mirrored the pale morning sky. "You know," he said, watching the water ripple, "I think healing happens in small moments like this. When you stop rushing and just let yourself be." I looked at him, the wind catching a few strands of hair across my face. "Maybe you're right," I said softly. "Maybe it's not about big changes, just quiet ones." He smiled and turned to me. "Exactly. When we parted," he said, "same time next week?" I hesitated, pretending to think, though I already knew my answer. "If you bring the coffee," I said. He grinned. "It's a deal." That week, I found myself thinking about the walk more than I should have. It wasn't romantic, not in the usual sense. It was something gentler, deeper. A reminder that connection didn't always have to be loud or sudden. Sometimes, it arrived like morning light, slow, steady, quietly filling the corners you'd forgotten were there. The next Saturday, we walked again. Then again the week after. Each time, we talked a little more about books, memories, dreams we thought we'd outgrown. I started to laugh more, to notice things I'd stopped seeing: the color of the sky at dusk, the way the trees bent toward the sun, the sound of my own footsteps beside someone else's. I didn't know what any of it meant, or where it was going. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. He'd surprised me once with coffee. Then again with kindness. But this time, what surprised me most was how natural it all felt, how something that began with a doctor's concern was slowly turning into something that reminded me I was still alive, still capable of feeling warmth where I thought only cold remained. It's strange how something simple can become a quiet constant in your life. Those Saturday walks with Dr. Carter began as small breaks in my week, but they soon became the thing I looked forward to the most. It wasn't the coffee, or even the walk itself. It was the way I felt when we talked. Unrushed. Unjudged. Understood. One morning, a few months after our first walk, I woke to a grey sky that looked like rain. My first thought was that he might cancel. But right at 9 o'clock, there he was, standing near our usual bench, umbrella in hand, smiling as if the world couldn't touch his calm. "You didn't think a little rain would stop me, did you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I laughed. "Honestly, I wasn't sure. You seem like the sensible type." He handed me the umbrella, shaking his head. "You'll learn that sometimes being sensible means knowing when not to be." We walked beneath the drizzle, the air cool and filled with that sweet, earthy scent that only comes when rain first meets dry ground. Our shoes splashed lightly in puddles, and the park, usually filled with chatter and movement, was hushed. Only the soft patter of rain and our footsteps broke the quiet. "I read something last night," I said, adjusting the umbrella between us. "It said people don't fall in love in grand moments, they fall in love in the small ones, like sharing silence or laughter that comes easy." He looked at me, thoughtful, but said nothing. For a moment, I wondered if I'd said too much, if I'd broken the invisible line we'd both carefully stayed behind. But then he said softly, "I think that's true. Love isn't thunder. It's more like rain, quiet, patient, steady." His words stayed with me long after the walk ended. That night, I found myself remembering the way he looked when he said it, the steadiness in his eyes, the slight smile that hinted at something he wasn't sure he should say. As the weeks passed, our conversations deepened. He told me about his late wife, how she'd been his anchor during the hardest years of medical school, and how losing her had left a silence so vast he thought he'd never fill it again. I told him about my daughter moving out, about the empty house that still felt like it was waiting for laughter to return. There was never anything rushed between us, never a word out of place. But there was understanding, a quiet thread that seemed to pull us closer without either of us meaning to. One Saturday, after our walk, he asked, "Do you ever think about doing something new? Something just for yourself?" I thought for a moment. "I used to paint," I said. "A long time ago. I stopped after my husband passed. It felt pointless." He tilted his head slightly. "What if it isn't about painting something beautiful? What if it's about remembering how color feels again?" That night, his words echoed in my head. The next morning, I found my old brushes in a box beneath the stairs, dusty and stiff. I cleaned them, laid them out on the kitchen table, and began to paint. Not flowers or landscapes, just strokes of color, soft blues, pale yellows, quiet greens. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive. When I told him about it the next week, his face lit up. "See," he said. "You didn't need a prescription. You just needed a reminder." It was the first time in years someone had believed in me without trying to fix me. That kind of belief does something to a person. It rearranges the way you see yourself. A few days later, my daughter called from out of state. "Mom," she said, "you sound different. Happier, maybe?" I smiled to myself. "I've been walking again. And painting." "Painting? You haven't painted in years." "I know," I said quietly. Someone reminded me I could. That evening, I sat by the window, brush in hand, and painted the park as I remembered it: rain on leaves, soft grey light, a man holding an umbrella and smiling like the rain was a gift, but something inside me also knew things were changing. What had started as friendship had begun to carry unspoken weight. There were pauses in our conversations now, small, uncertain moments where words hovered between us but never landed. One morning, I found myself hesitating before heading to the park. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was afraid of what I was beginning to feel, or maybe I was afraid of ruining something pure by naming it. When I arrived, he noticed. "You're quiet today," he said gently. I looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Sometimes I think I've forgotten how to let good things stay simple." He nodded slowly. "It's hard, isn't it? When something unexpected starts to mean more than you planned." We stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind in the trees filling the silence between us. And though neither of us said it out loud, I think we both knew. Something had shifted. He surprised me again, not with words this time, but with presence. The kind that doesn't demand, doesn't expect, just stays. That night, as I closed my eyes, I thought about the way he'd looked at me when I said goodbye. It wasn't longing. It was recognition. Two souls who'd both walked through loss, finding a quiet place to rest beside each other. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew that whatever it was, it had already changed me. The days began to stretch longer, sunlight lasting just a little bit more each evening. Spring had melted into summer, and by then, my walks with Dr. Carter were no longer something unusual. They had quietly become a part of my life, as natural as morning coffee or evening light. But life has a way of testing what we think we can hold on to. It started with a letter. Not one of those quick, printed notices, but an envelope with a handwritten return address, the hospital's seal in the corner. Inside was a short note: "Dr. Carter will be leaving the city hospital to begin a new position in Denver." My chest went hollow when I read it. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. I told myself it was fine. People move, lives change. But the quiet ache that settled in me said otherwise. I didn't call him right away. I didn't even know what to say. What do you say to someone who's become part of your healing when they suddenly won't be there anymore? When Saturday came, I went to the park anyway, though I wasn't sure if he would be there. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't show. The morning air was still, heavy with the scent of rain from the night before. Then, I saw him walking toward me, a small smile on his face, though his eyes carried that familiar calm shadow. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you weren't going to tell me?" He sighed softly. "I wanted to," he said. "I just didn't know how." We walked without speaking for a while. The park felt different that morning, as if it knew something was ending. Children's laughter seemed distant, the birds quieter somehow. Finally, I stopped near the lake, the same place where he'd once told me that healing happens in small moments. "You said once that healing means letting yourself be," I said. "Does it also mean letting people go?" He looked at me, really looked, before answering. "Sometimes, yes. But letting go doesn't erase what something meant." I nodded, my throat tightening. "How long will you be gone?" He hesitated. "It's not temporary. They've offered me a position to oversee a new medical program. It's a good opportunity." I wanted to be proud of him. And I was. But I also wanted to ask him to stay, even though I knew I couldn't. Life doesn't give us that kind of choice without taking something in return. We sat on the bench by the lake, the one where we'd first shared coffee. He handed me a folded piece of paper. "It's my new address," he said. "Just in case you ever feel like writing. I'd like to know how your painting goes." I took it, my fingers brushing his. "And if I don't write?" He smiled faintly. "Then I'll still be grateful I met you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say that words could fix. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and I found myself studying his face, trying to memorize it: the calm lines, the quiet strength, the way his eyes held kindness even in goodbye. When we finally stood, he said, "You were right that first day. Sometimes the simplest things surprise us the most." I smiled through the ache. "And sometimes, the right people find us when we've stopped looking." He nodded, and then, with a soft touch on my shoulder, he turned and walked away down the path. I watched him go until he disappeared into the morning light, leaving me standing there with the sound of the wind and the faint echo of his footsteps fading behind him. That night, the house felt emptier than usual. I sat by the window with my brushes laid out in front of me. I started painting without thinking, colors spilling onto the canvas in waves of blue and gold. By the time I stopped, I realized I had painted the park again, but this time, there were two figures walking beneath an umbrella, one just a little ahead, the other following. Weeks passed. Then months. And slowly, the ache softened into something gentler. Life began to fill itself again. I kept painting. I started volunteering at a local community center. Sometimes, I'd still walk in the park alone, carrying a small thermos of coffee, sitting on our bench, and letting the world move quietly around me. Then, one late autumn afternoon, I received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakably his, steady, deliberate. He wrote, "I hope you're still painting. The mountains here are beautiful, but I think about the lake often. You reminded me that healing isn't just about helping others, it's about allowing someone to reach you, too. I'm grateful you reached me." I read it 3 times, each word sinking deeper. Then I folded it carefully and placed it beside my brushes. Sometimes life doesn't give us forever, but it gives us moments that last longer than time. Moments that change the rhythm of our days, the way we see ourselves, the way we breathe. Dr. Carter surprised me once with coffee, then with kindness, then with friendship, and in the end, with the realization that I was never really broken, just waiting to be seen. Now, when I walk by the lake, I smile at the quiet water and whisper a thank you to him, to the seasons, to the unexpected ways life reminds us we're still capable of beginning again, because sometimes the most beautiful chapters don't end with a grand declaration, they end with peace. And peace, I've learned, is the most healing surprise of all.